So today I'm going to demo how to automatically provision a server using two different services, DigitalOcean and Amazon Web Services. And in the end, I will have created a Droplet, which is a server in DigitalOcean, and I will also have created an EC2 instance, which is a server in Amazon Web Services. So let's start with DigitalOcean and head on over to the code that is going to make all this work. So the code is written in Node.js, and there are only two dependencies, Needle and AWS SDK. Needle is HTTP client, and AWS SDK is obviously the SDK to make API calls to Amazon Web Services. All right, so to make this work, you'll need to grab your API token for DigitalOcean and set that as an environment variable. In Node.js, we have this handy process.env object that gives you access to all your user variables on your laptop. So we grab our DO token environment variable, which is what I defined it as, so that we can use it in the HTTP headers, which I've defined here. Now let's go over the next piece, which is the client object, which is essentially just a dictionary of all the functions that I'm going to call that reflect the API call that I'm making. So get droplet, we are just grabbing a droplet given an ID. So we define a function with the ID and onResponse callback function, which we'll define later. And we use Needle to make the HTTP GET request on this specific URL given the ID. We're going to pass in that header that we define up here, and then we're going to also pass in a callback function, which we'll define later. For create droplet, it's basically the same thing, except we're passing in a few more things, droplet name, region, image name. We're also passing in a JSON object that defines some parameters for the image that we're creating. And one thing to note about this is that you need to grab your SSH key that is associated with your DigitalOcean account, and you can do that with this handy curl command. And once you have that ID, you can pass it into this attribute SSH_keys. And so once you've done that and you have your data, you're going to do a needle.post, which is going to do the HTTP post on the same URL, but given the data that defines our image. And then we're also going to provide another attribute for the headers dictionary, JSON, and say true, because we're providing data that is JSON. And then lastly, we have a list droplets, which essentially just lists all the droplets that we have so that we can print them out. So here are the actual calls that we're making, client.createDroplet. You can see the variables we're passing in here, and here's the callback function that we're defining for the onResponse. And all we're doing here is checking to see if we've successfully created the droplet, and we just print the JSON body of that response object. List droplets is then going to print our droplets with the droplet ID and the IP address, which you can grab from the droplet object. And you can notice here that we're also doing a get droplet API call, which we've defined in our client object. And we pass in the droplet ID so that we can print it, and we grab the IP address as well. So let's see that in action now. All right, so now let's talk about the code that will create an EC2 instance on Amazon Web Services. Two things you'll need before you run this code: the access key ID and the secret access key. These you can grab from the IAM console, which is the identity and access management settings on the website. So once you have those and set as environment variables, you can grab them the way we've done before with process.env. And you're going to need that to update the configuration for the AWS object. And that's what we've done right here in this block. And you can see that we've also defined a region in which the instance will be created. Then we actually create the instance with new aws.ec2, and we supply an API version for that service object. The next thing we need to do is define a params JSON, which contains parameters for an AMI. And what that stands for is Amazon Machine Images. And this is basically, you can think of it as configuration for the instance. Things like permissions, operating system, the number of images that you want to create. And so we're going to pass that into a run instances method, which is going to create our EC2 instance. And So all that's going to do here is we're going to define a callback function, and we're going to tag that instance with a name called demo EC2. And what's going to happen once we create this, to verify that we've actually been successful, we can go back to our AWS console, the EC2 console to be specific, and look at the instance name, and we should see demo EC2. You'll see that in a minute. And that's all we're doing with create tags. We're just setting the name of that instance. Once we've done that, all we're going to do is we're going to print out the ID of the EC2 instance and the public IP address. And we can do that with the describe instances method. And all we need to do is pass in a params object, which is basically only going to contain an instance IDs list with just the one instance ID item that, of our EC2 instance. And we're going to use that params to call describe instances and again print out the instance ID and the public IP address. So let's see that in action.